At every service interval, Harley recommends that you change all your fluids in your bike. Harley is one of the few manufacturers, if not the only one, that has 3 unique cases: the engine case, the tranny, and the primary case. So each case is divided and has its own reservoir for oil. In a CVO, they run the SYN 3 oil in all 3 cases. This stuff is expensive and has a great wear life. And one of the cool things about having it in all 3 cases is if you go on a long road trip, you can bring a bottle of this and top off any of the cases that you need to. In my case, I really recommend using the gear oil, which they now offer in a synthetic. They offered this in the Formula Plus, and now they offer it in this, which is fully synthetic, and it's much heavier than the SYN 3. And over the years, I found that the heavier oil in the tranny and the primary case really quiets things down. It gets rid of some of that annoying engine noise because it's a heavier fluid. And I'm a firm believer in running it. There is a ton of debate as to what oil is best for your Harley. I recommend you use what you believe in. There is nothing wrong with using what works for you. Now, if you're on the road and you happen to need oil and you don't have any, Harley-Davidson recommends a diesel oil. But they also recommend you don't go too long with that. So as soon as you can, change that out. The other question that comes up is if you're running the synthetic oil, can you change back to mineral oil or vice versa? The answer is yes. You can drain the case completely or the compartment completely, and then you can change back to mineral oil or to a synthetic oil. That is possible. In the Harley-Davidson owner's manual, they actually give you the directions to change all 3 fluids. So you can look for how to change each compartment and its proper fluid. All 3 engine cases use a 5/8-inch drain plug. So you'll need a 5/8-inch 6-point socket to remove them. It's very important to have the engine hot. You want those fluids loose so that they drain out. It's also my recommendation you have it on the side stand. Harley with the Milwaukee 8 moved the tranny drain plug over by the oil drain plug. So now all the fluids are leaning over towards those drain plugs if you have it on the side stand. It's also important to have air coming in. So you want to remove your oil dipstick, your tranny dipstick, and in case of the primary, you want to remove that cover. You want that air flowing in to help the oil come out. I also let my bike sit overnight. You'd be amazed at how much additional fluid comes out when you let the bike sit. So let's talk about the oil filter. Harley has changed this oil filter recently. They made it a bit longer to improve filtering for the Milwaukee 8 engines. So they call it the Super Premium 5, and it comes in the oil change kits, or if you buy it separately, you can get black or chrome. The oil filter is rather difficult to remove on these new CVOs. There just isn't enough room to get in there. So I recommend you actually pull the coolant reservoir off and hang it to the side. But I also found you really need to remove the horn. That horn is a horrible spot. It sticks out, and I think Harley should rethink where they mount the horn. But if you pull that off, it'll give you some additional room, especially when reinstalling it. And when you take the oil filter off, you can go with one of these funnels. Harley offers this funnel specific for the Milwaukee 8. Be careful, there are 2 part numbers, one for the twin cams and older and one for the Milwaukee 8s. And there's quite a bit of comments that this does not work. I actually found this worked really well, at least on this 121. It really kept the oil from spilling all down the front of the engine, and it did drain. You had to feed this through behind the horn. When removing your oil filter, Harley-Davidson offers a couple oil filter wrenches. And the feedback has been that they're fairly flimsy and that they bend over time. They're really meant for home use and not for commercial use. And with the 121 cubic inch motor, we no longer have the crank position sensor blocking the oil filter. So you actually have plenty of room to use whatever tool you would like. I really like using this tool. I like it because when you're loosening, it puts force down on the oil filter, and it really grabs. And it's narrow, so it has plenty of clearance around items that might be in the way. I'll put a link in the description of this one if you'd like to try it out. When installing the oil filter, it's extremely important to not over tighten it. So you're going to put a little oil around the rubber gasket, and then I like to fill my oil filter about halfway. And then you're going to spin that on with your hand, and when it touches, you want to try to go about a quarter more with your hand. It is very tight with all that radiator and all that stuff in front, but again, do it by hand. Don't pull your wrench back out and over tighten that oil filter. Changing your oil at the 1,000-mile mark is very important because you're looking to see how well the engine is wearing in. And one way to tell that is to look at the magnetic tip of the oil plug. You're looking to see what kind of shavings have gathered there. And you can see by my 3 plugs, I have very little shavings, if any at all. The primary produced some shavings, which is not unusual. There's a lot of metal contact with that big primary chain running around. But you don't want any of your drain plugs to have metal chunks stuck to it, like this one. This would be excessive to me, and I want to dig into why this is occurring. You can see by my 3 drain plugs that they all look very clean. In fact, almost perfect. I was pretty impressed. As time goes on and technology improves, Harley is able to really manufacture these engine cases with quite precision, and they just don't create shavings like they used to. When reinstalling your drain plugs, it's important to clean them off first. I like to use a simple brass brush, and you can use some brake clean with a paper towel and a pick if you need to get some of that sealant off the threads. It is not recommended that you reuse the O-rings. I have found these are pretty common, and it's really a number 41 O-ring. You can pick them up at your local hardware store or order them online at Amazon. You do not want to use pipe thread tape on your drain plugs. Should some of it peel off and run around your engine case, there are tiny little oil passages that could plug up and create a real disaster. It is a good idea to instead use a thread sealant. You can really pick one of your choice. You can use the high temp or not, but you want to be careful. Just put a sparing amount, a little dab on the threads and spin it in. You do not want the thread sealant on either end of the drain plug, so keep it in the middle. When feeding your drain plug in, I like to do it by hand. You want to make sure those threads are engaging correctly. And you should be able to spin that plug in all the way by hand. And when you get near the end, you want to make sure that O-ring does not rip. So I go really carefully and feed that drain plug in slowly, making sure that O-ring does not rip and makes full contact. Then grab your torque wrench and 14 to 21 foot-pounds. With all of your drain plugs cleaned and new O-rings and torqued back in with sealant, you're now ready to fill each cavity with fluid. Starting with the engine case, Harley recommends 4 quarts. I always start with about 3.5 quarts or 3 3/4. I'm a firm believer in not overfilling the crankcase and actually filling it a little bit less than spec. I believe that with the Milwaukee 8s, that extra airspace really helps with the blow-by and the pressure. And so I always run it at the lower end of the dipstick. One thing to note, you should always check your oil level when the engine is hot and on the side stand. They also offer an upright set of markings on the dipstick, but it's easier just to put it on the side stand and check it. But you do want to check it when it's hot. And again, I tend to run lower on the scale. I find a smaller funnel works really well. It allows me to put the bottle in there and it'll hold it in place to get the last bit of that oil out of that bottle. It is expensive. With the transmission, you're really looking for about 28 ounces of fluid. And it's a small, tight area. So I've had really good luck with this tool. It has the measurements in ounces on the side so you can fill it up to 28 ounces, and then it locks. So you turn this and the oil starts to flow through, and this tube makes it real easy to get it into that small plug. So this works really well. I'll put a link in the description. One thing to note, the transmission dipstick on the new 23 CVOs is plastic. I was really kind of surprised. It's black, So it looks nice, but it's plastic completely. Is that just weight savings, money savings, or what? But either way, it is still hard to read where your transmission oil level is. Whether on the chrome one or this new black one, it's just hard to see. Just shoot for the 28 ounces. You do not want to put any real torque on that plastic dipstick. It will break. The specification is 25 to 75 inch-pounds. The recommendation for the primary case is 30 ounces. And I find that this filter from Harley actually works really well. It's one of the best designs I've ever come across. And again, it'll hold the bottle in place so you can get the last drop of that fluid out. In this case, I find 30 ounces really too short. You need almost a full quart to fill that up. You're trying to get the level on the outer diameter of the clutch hub. So you want to keep filling and checking until you reach that mark. Again, remember, the motorcycle needs to be upright, otherwise it's just going to pour out the opening. When reinstalling the primary cover, you're going to really want to clean off the inside. And you're going to want to take that O-ring gasket out and wipe it off. Now, the recommendation is that you replace that gasket every time. I can tell you from my experience, I've never bought a new one. I've reused it for many thousands of miles without any issue. So up to you, but it is a good idea to pull it out and wipe it off with a paper towel. Reinstalling it can be rather tricky. Those little nubs just don't want to stay in that circle, so you kind of have to use all your fingers pushing it once to get it seated. Once you have it in there, you're going to go ahead and reinstall it following this sequence. With the fluid in, you're going to wipe off this surface, including in here. You probably got some oil on there. And you're going to put your cover back on in a star pattern. So you'll start with the top screw and then down, across, over, and back down. You're going to tighten these to an 84 to 108 inch-pounds. Do not over torque these. They will strip. I no longer use Loctite on these. That was, I think, tradition to put Loctite on them. I've stopped using Loctite. It keeps the threads a lot cleaner, and I get a lot better torque sequence, and I've had no issues with any leaking. And then I like to run these in by hand to get them started, completely by hand. So again, the logo's the right way. We'll place that on there. We'll run that by hand. It should spin completely freely. Put a little pressure on the cover. Then spin them all in, and then do your torque sequence. Top, bottom, over, across, until you complete a star pattern. So now that you've replaced all your fluids, it's a good time to go for a ride. Get all those fluids up to temperature and then check their levels, at least the tranny and your engine case. And by the way, if you end up seeing a few drops of oil below your Harley, don't panic. It's probably some of that oil from that oil filter leaking down from the front. In my case, I had no problem removing it with that handy funnel. But when I went to reinstall it with some new oil in the filter, most of it came out because that dang horn was in the way. So important to remove that. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I tried to give you some of my tips and products that I use for fluid changes. And I do want to call out that this week Harley Davidson actually released some how-to videos to change your oil. I think it's one of the first times I've ever seen Harley release a how-to video. They did a very nice job, and I think they should do more of it. I'll put a link to these in the description. But I hope you learned something, and you'll go share that information with someone else. Until next time, in the friction zone.